Good evening, and welcome to Slumber Scrolls. Tonight, we venture into the realm of divine marriage and celestial authority, into stories of jealousy and power, to explore the life of the most complex queen the ancient Greeks ever knew. Please like and subscribe before the journey commences. Before we begin, it is worth noting that Greek mythology does not have a single, definitive version. These stories come to us from many ancient sources. Poets like Hesiod and Homer, playwrights like Euripides and Aeschylus, historians and mythographers writing centuries apart. Sometimes these sources agree, sometimes they contradict each other, and sometimes they offer fascinating variations on the same tale. Where the stories diverge, we will explore the most widely accepted versions while acknowledging when other tellings exist. Get comfortable, settle in, and let us begin our journey through the complete mythic life of Hera, the Queen of Olympus. Introduction. The paradox of the Queen Hera occupies a unique and fascinating position in Greek mythology. She is simultaneously one of the most powerful deities in the pantheon and one of the most constrained. She sits on a throne beside Zeus, sharing in the governance of gods and mortals, yet she cannot prevent her husband from pursuing countless affairs with other women. She commands respect and fear from both divine and mortal realms, yet her mythology is dominated by stories of humiliation and revenge. She is the goddess of marriage, yet her own marriage is among the most troubled in all of mythology. To understand Hera, we must hold these contradictions in our minds without trying to resolve them too quickly. She was not a simple character, not easily categorized as hero or villain, victim or oppressor. She was, like the best mythological figures, deeply human in her complexity despite being entirely divine in her nature. The ancient Greeks who worshipped her understood this complexity and honored her not despite it, but because of it. Hera's name itself carries significance, though its exact etymology remains a matter of scholarly debate. Some ancient sources translated it as lady or mistress, a title of respect and authority rather than a personal name. This would make Hera less an individual identity and more a recognition of her role and status. Others have connected her name to the Greek word for protector, or to ancient words meaning earth or hour, suggesting various aspects of her divine nature and functions. Whatever the origins of her name, Hera's identity was inseparable from her role as queen. She was born to rule, destined to sit beside the most powerful god in the cosmos, fated to preside over the most important institution in human society, marriage. Her mythology reflects the tensions inherent in these roles, the difficulties of wielding power within systems that both grant and limit authority, the challenges of maintaining dignity when subjected to repeated humiliation. As we explore Hera's story, we will encounter her in many aspects. We will see her as a victim, swallowed by her father as an infant and freed only through her brother's courage. We will see her as a bride, courted by Zeus and elevated to the position of queen. We will see her as a protector, guarding the sanctity of marriage and blessing those who honor it. We will see her as an avenger, pursuing Zeus's lovers and their children with relentless fury. And we will see her as a political actor, using her intelligence and her position to influence events both divine and mortal. Each of these aspects reveals something important about how the ancient Greeks understood power, gender, marriage, and divinity. Hera's myths were not merely entertaining stories, but reflections of real concerns and real experiences, projected onto the divine realm where they could be examined and contemplated in their most extreme and dramatic forms. Birth and the shadow of Cronus Hera's story begins, like those of her siblings, in darkness and fear, in the belly of a god driven mad by prophecy and paranoia. To understand her beginnings, we must first understand the world into which she was born, a world ruled by the Titan Cronus, who had overthrown his own father Uranus but could not escape the pattern of violence and succession that defined his family line. Cronus ruled from his throne atop Mount Othrys in the south, lord of the cosmos, commander of the Titans, seemingly secure in his power. But a prophecy haunted him, words spoken by his dying father Uranus as Cronus castrated him with a sickle of flint. Just as Cronus had overthrown Uranus, so too would Cronus be overthrown by one of his own children. The curse was spoken, and in the world of Greek mythology, prophecies always came true eventually, no matter what steps were taken to prevent them. Cronus married his sister Rhea, and in time she became pregnant with their first child. When the baby was born, a daughter, Cronus felt the cold touch of fear. This child, or one of her siblings, would someday take his throne, would cast him down as he had cast down his own father. The thought was unbearable, the threat too great to ignore. So Cronus did something that would define him forever in myth and memory. He took his newborn daughter, so small and helpless, and he swallowed her whole. The infant disappeared into the Titan's gullet, trapped in the darkness of his body, unable to grow, unable to escape, unable to fulfill any destiny at all. This first child was Hestia, who would eventually become the goddess of the hearth and home. But she was not the last to suffer this fate. When Rhea bore a second daughter, Cronus swallowed her too. This was Demeter, future goddess of the harvest and growing grain. A third daughter followed, and she too was consumed by her fearful father. This was Hera, who would one day sit as queen beside Zeus, but who spent her earliest existence in the dark prison of Cronus's belly. Inside Cronus, the three sisters existed in a strange state. They were gods, and gods cannot truly die. They continued to grow and develop despite their imprisonment, aging from infants to children to young goddesses even in that impossible place. They were aware, conscious, experiencing the slow passage of time in darkness and isolation. What did they think about during those long years? What did they feel? The myths do not tell us, but we can imagine the fear, the confusion, the desperate hope that somehow, someday, this nightmare would end. Rhea continued to bear children, and Cronus continued to swallow them. A fourth child came, a son this time, named Hades. He joined his sisters in the darkness. A fifth child, another son called Poseidon, suffered the same fate. 5 children, 5 divine beings with their own destinies and purposes, all trapped inside their father, all prevented from living the lives they were meant to lead. Rhea's pain at this was immeasurable. 5 times she had carried a child in her womb, felt it grow and move, gone through the labor of birth, held a newborn infant in her arms. 5 times she had watched her husband take that child from her and swallow it, condemning it to imprisonment and denying her the joy of motherhood. The cruelty of it, the violation of the most basic bonds between parent and child, was almost beyond bearing. But Rhea was not without her own resources. She was a Titaness, daughter of Gaia the earth and Uranus the sky. She had power and wisdom of her own, and she had connections to forces even older and more fundamental than the Titans. When she became pregnant for a 6th time, she decided that this child would not suffer the fate of its siblings. This child would live, would grow to adulthood in the world of light and air, would fulfill the destiny that the prophecy had foretold. Rhea went to her mother Gaia, the primordial earth, and together they devised a plan. When the time came for the birth, Rhea did not go to Cronus. Instead, she fled to the island of Crete, to a cave hidden in the mountains. There, far from her husband's knowledge, she gave birth to her 6th child, a son she named Zeus. Zeus was different from the moment of his birth. His cry shook the trees. His eyes opened before his first day had passed. When he grasped his mother's finger, the strength in that tiny hand seemed to contain the weight of destiny itself. Rhea knew that this child would be the one to fulfill the prophecy, to overthrow Cronus and free his siblings. But first, he had to survive. Rhea could not keep Zeus with her. Cronus would eventually notice her absence and come searching. The deception had to be complete. So Rhea took a stone, roughly the size and shape of a newborn infant, and wrapped it in swaddling clothes. She carried this false baby back to Cronus and placed it in his arms. Cronus, so consumed by his fear and paranoia that he had grown careless, did not examine the bundle closely. He simply opened his jaws wide and swallowed what he thought was his sixth child, just as he had swallowed the 5 before. The stone settled heavily in his stomach alongside the actual divine children already imprisoned there, and Cronus believed that the threat had been dealt with once again. Meanwhile, on Crete, the infant Zeus was being cared for by others. Rhea had entrusted him to guardians who would keep him safe and help him grow strong. The divine goat Amalthea nursed him with milk that was more than mere sustenance, imbuing him with divine strength and power. The Curetes, warrior priests, danced outside his cave with their spears and shields, making noise to drown out any sound the infant might make that could reach Cronus's ears. Inside Cronus's belly, Hera and her siblings waited in darkness, unaware that salvation was being prepared, that a brother they had never met was growing to maturity with the specific purpose of freeing them and overthrowing their father. They existed in that timeless place, divine children trapped in an eternal childhood, unable to fulfill their purposes or take their places in the cosmic order. This imprisonment would shape Hera in ways that would last throughout her mythological existence. She learned early that power could be arbitrary and cruel, that even the closest family bonds could be violated, that security was never guaranteed no matter how mighty one's protector claimed to be. She experienced helplessness, isolation, and fear at the most fundamental level. These experiences, this trauma of her earliest existence, would influence how she later wielded power and how she responded to threats to her own authority and dignity. Years passed. Zeus grew to maturity on Crete, trained by the goat, protected by the warriors, visited in secret by his mother and grandmother, taught about his destiny and his purpose. He learned that he had siblings trapped inside their father. He learned about the prophecy and about the pattern of violence and succession that had defined his family for generations. And he learned that he was meant to break this pattern, to create something new, to establish an order that would be more just and more stable than what had come before. When the time was right, when Zeus had grown strong enough and wise enough, he left his hidden sanctuary and went to confront Cronus. With the help of the Titaness Métis, who crafted a special potion, Zeus managed to trick Cronus into consuming an emetic. The Titan king, suddenly and violently ill, began to vomit forth everything he had swallowed. First came the stone, the false Zeus wrapped in now rotting swaddling clothes, falling to the ground with a heavy thud. Then came the divine children, emerging in reverse order from how they had been swallowed. Poseidon came first, no longer an infant but a fully grown god, powerful and fierce. Then Hades, grim and dark, marked by his time in darkness. Then Hera, regal and beautiful despite her ordeal. Then Demeter, bringing with her an aura of growing things and fertile earth. And finally Hestia, the eldest, serene and gentle despite being the first to suffer imprisonment. 5 gods and goddesses stood together for the first time, freed after years of imprisonment, confronting the father who had swallowed them and the brother who had saved them. Hera looked upon Zeus with wonder and gratitude. He had freed them, had brought them into the light, had given them the chance to live the lives they were meant to live. In that moment of liberation, a bond was forged between them, a connection that would eventually lead to marriage and to the establishment of the divine order that would rule from Mount Olympus. But that future still lay ahead. First, there would be war. The Titanomachy, forging a queen in battle, the freeing of Cronus's children, did not immediately lead to peace. The old order, represented by Cronus and most of the Titans, would not willingly surrender power to this new generation of gods. What followed was the Titanomachy, a war that would last 10 years and reshape the cosmos, forging the Olympian gods in the crucible of divine combat. Hera's role in this great war is not extensively detailed in the surviving myths. Unlike Zeus with his thunderbolts or Poseidon with his earthquakes, Hera did not have obvious martial powers that could be deployed in direct combat. Yet the war would have been impossible to win without her, and the myths that mention her involvement suggest that she contributed in crucial ways. The Olympian gods, as Zeus and his siblings came to be called, established their base on Mount Olympus in the north, the highest peak in Greece. From this natural fortress, they could survey the surrounding lands and defend against attack. The Titans, meanwhile, held Mount Othrys in the south, Cronus's traditional seat of power. Between these two mountains, across the fields and valleys of the mortal world, the war would be fought. Hera understood that victory required more than brute force. It required strategy, alliances, the marshalling of resources, and the coordination of efforts. She worked behind the scenes, using her intelligence and her persuasive abilities to strengthen the Olympian cause. Some Titans, recognizing that the prophecy could not be denied and that the future belonged to Zeus's generation, defected to the Olympian side. Hera's diplomacy helped secure some of these crucial defections. Themis, the Titaness of divine law and natural order, sided with the Olympians, and her presence lent legitimacy to their cause. They were not merely rebels, but representatives of a new and more just order. Prometheus, whose name meant forethought and who could see how the war would end, chose to fight for the future rather than the past. These and other Titans brought their power and their knowledge to the Olympian cause, and Hera's ability to integrate them into the new divine order, to make them feel valued and respected rather than merely tolerated, strengthened Zeus's coalition. Hera also served as a source of resolve and determination for the Olympians during the darkest moments of the war. 10 years of continuous combat took a toll even on immortal gods. There were moments of doubt, times when victory seemed impossible and the cost of continued resistance too high. In these moments, Hera reminded her siblings and allies of what they were fighting for: not just power, but justice; not just victory, but liberation from tyranny; not just a new order, but a better one. She maintained morale, arbitrated disputes, and ensured that the Olympian alliance remained cohesive even under the stress of prolonged war. When egos clashed or tempers flared, as they inevitably did among powerful beings fighting under desperate circumstances, Hera helped mediate and reconcile, preventing the alliance from fracturing from within. The turning point in the war came when Zeus descended into Tartarus, the deepest prison beneath the earth, and freed the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires, the monstrous children of Gaia and Uranus whom Cronus had imprisoned. These beings, grateful for their liberation and eager for revenge against their former jailer, brought formidable power to the Olympian cause. The Cyclopes, master craftsmen despite their monstrous appearance, forged weapons for the Olympian gods. For Zeus, they created the thunderbolts that would become his signature weapons. For Poseidon, they crafted a trident that could shake the earth and command the seas. For Hades, they fashioned a helmet of invisibility. These weapons, imbued with primordial power, gave the Olympians advantages that the Titans could not counter. For Hera, the Cyclopes created something different. The ancient sources are not entirely clear on what gifts she received, but some traditions suggest she was given items that enhanced her queenly authority and her ability to command respect and obedience. Perhaps it was her scepter, topped with a cuckoo bird, or perhaps it was her crown, the tall cylindrical polos that marked her as a queen. Whatever the specifics, the gifts acknowledged Hera's importance to the Olympian cause and equipped her to fulfill her role in the new divine order. The Hecatonchires, the 100-handed giants, became living siege engines. When they joined the battle, they could hurl hundreds of boulders simultaneously, creating a devastating barrage that no defense could withstand. Their intervention on the Olympian side turned the tide decisively. The Titans, overwhelmed by this new assault and by the divine weapons wielded against them, began to falter. The final battle centered on Mount Othrys itself. Zeus led the assault, hurling his thunderbolts at the Titan stronghold, while Poseidon shook the mountain's foundations with his trident. The Hecatonkaias bombarded the summit with stones torn from the earth. The defenders fought back with desperate ferocity, but they were fighting against fate itself, against the prophecy that had doomed Cronus from the moment he first feared it. When Cronus finally fell and the Titan resistance collapsed, the war was effectively over. The defeated Titans were bound and cast into Tartarus, imprisoned in the deepest darkness beneath the world. The same Cyclopes and Hecatonkaias who had fought for the Olympians became their jailers, ensuring that the old gods would never again threaten the new order. But not all Titans were imprisoned. Those who had sided with Zeus, like Themis and Prometheus, were honored and given places in the new divine hierarchy. The Titanesses who had not fought in the war, including Rhea, were allowed to retain their positions and their dignity. This measured approach to victory, punishing enemies but rewarding allies and showing mercy to non-combatants, helped establish the Olympians as legitimate rulers rather than mere conquerors. With the war won, the three brothers who had led the Olympian forces divided the cosmos among them. Zeus took the sky and the upper air, becoming king of the gods and ruler of Olympus. Poseidon took the seas and all the waters of the world. Hades took the underworld, the realm of the dead beneath the earth. The earth itself and Mount Olympus were declared common ground, belonging to no single god but shared by all. This division created a power structure with Zeus at its apex, but with his brothers as independent rulers in their own domains. It prevented the concentration of all power in a single deity's hands, a lesson learned from the failures of Cronus and Uranus before him. And it created a need for coordination and cooperation among the rulers, a need that would eventually lead to the establishment of formal divine councils and governance structures. Hera's position in this new order was not yet fully defined. She was one of the Olympian gods, freed from Cronus's belly and crucial to the victory in the war. But she was not one of the three brothers who had divided the cosmos. Her role, her authority, her place in the hierarchy, all of these remained to be determined. That determination would come through marriage, through her union with Zeus, through her elevation to the position of Queen of the Gods. But that momentous event lay ahead, and it would come about through a courtship as complex and problematic as the marriage it would create. The courtship, from Cuckoo to crown the story of how Zeus courted and won Hera, is told in various ways by different ancient sources, but all versions agree on certain key points. Zeus desired Hera, seeing in her the qualities that would make her the ideal queen and consort. Hera, for her part, was not immediately amenable to his advances. She valued her independence, and was perhaps wary of binding herself to Zeus in so permanent a fashion. The most famous version of the courtship involves Zeus's transformation into a cuckoo bird. Zeus, observing Hera and looking for a way to approach her that would lower her defenses, transformed himself into a small bird, bedraggled and shivering as if caught in a storm. He arranged to appear before Hera in this pathetic state, a creature clearly in need of help and comfort. Hera's response revealed something important about her character. Despite being a powerful goddess, despite having every reason to be wary and self-protective after her experiences, she was moved by compassion for this small, suffering creature. She took the cuckoo into her arms, holding it close to her chest to warm it with her own body heat, protecting it from the cold and the elements. Only then, when she had demonstrated her capacity for compassion and care, did Zeus reveal his true form. The small bird suddenly transformed into the king of the gods, standing before her in all his power and majesty. He declared his love for her and his desire to make her his queen, to share his throne and his rule over the cosmos. Even in this revelation, even with Zeus standing before her and declaring his intentions, Hera did not immediately agree to marry him. She had questions, concerns, conditions that needed to be addressed. What would her role be? What authority would she have? How would they govern together? Zeus, accustomed to being obeyed rather than negotiated with, found himself in the unusual position of having to persuade and promise rather than simply command. The courtship itself became a kind of negotiation between equals, establishing patterns that would define their marriage. Zeus promised Hera a position of true partnership, sharing the throne and the governance of Olympus. He swore that she would be honored by all gods and mortals as the Queen of Heaven. He agreed that marriage and family, traditionally areas of female concern, would be her particular domain, where her word would be supreme. Hera, in turn, agreed to marry Zeus and to become his queen. But she made her own demands and extracted her own promises. Zeus would honor the sanctity of their marriage. She would have a voice in divine councils, the right to speak and to be heard. Her temples would be built across the Greek world, her worship established wherever Zeus was honored. The agreement they reached was more a treaty between powerful entities than a simple love match. When the divine wedding finally took place, it was celebrated with appropriate grandeur. All the gods gathered to witness the union of Zeus and Hera, the establishment of divine marriage that would serve as the model for all mortal marriages to come. The ceremony took place in a garden, surrounded by beauty and abundance, with the earth itself bringing forth new flowers to honor the occasion. The Muses sang, their voices blending in harmonies that had never been heard before. The seasons performed a dance, representing the cycles of nature and time. The hours attended the bride, helping her prepare and ensuring that everything proceeded according to proper custom and ritual. Animals from across the earth came to pay homage, recognizing that this union would affect the entire cosmos. Gifts were presented to the bride. The most famous of these came from Gaia herself, who gave Hera a tree that bore golden apples. These apples of immortality were planted in a special garden at the western edge of the world, guarded by nymphs called the Hesperides and by a never-sleeping dragon. The gift symbolized the eternal nature of the marriage and Hera's elevation to the highest position in the divine hierarchy. The wedding night was said to have lasted 300 years, a mythological way of expressing the intensity and the significance of this first union between Zeus and Hera. When they finally emerged, Hera wore a crown that marked her as queen. She carried a scepter that represented her authority to command. She had transformed from one of 6 liberated siblings into the Queen of Olympus, the goddess whose approval and blessing would be sought by all who honored the gods. The marriage produced several children over the years that followed. Ares, the god of war, was born from their union, inheriting Zeus's power and Hera's fierce protective instincts. Hebe, goddess of youth, embodied the renewal and vitality that the divine marriage was supposed to bring. Eileithyia, goddess of childbirth, reflected Hera's role as protector of women in labor and blessed mothers with safe deliveries. Some traditions also credit Hephaestus as a son of Zeus and Hera, though other versions claim Hera bore him alone, without Zeus's involvement, in a kind of parthenogenesis performed in retaliation for Zeus's birth of Athena from his own head. The confusion in the myths surrounding Hephaestus's parentage perhaps reflects real tensions in the divine marriage, questions about whose children were whose and whose authority extended over what. But if the wedding was magnificent and the early years of the marriage productive, the relationship itself proved far more complicated than the wedding vows suggested. Zeus's promise of fidelity, made with such apparent sincerity during the courtship, began to erode almost immediately. The king of the gods, it seemed, could not resist pursuing other women, could not contain his desire within the bounds of marriage, could not honor the very institution he had sworn to uphold. Hera's response to these betrayals would define much of her mythology. She could not leave Zeus or divorce him. Such concepts did not exist in the divine realm in ways that would have been acceptable or practical. She could not overrule him or prevent him from doing as he wished. But she could make her displeasure known. She could punish those who participated in Zeus's affairs, even if they had no choice in the matter. She could assert her dignity and her authority in ways that reminded all Olympus that she was queen, regardless of her husband's behavior. The divine marriage that had begun with such promise, such celebration, such hope for a new and better order, became instead a source of conflict and pain. Hera remained queen, powerful and respected, but increasingly defined by her role as the jealous wife, the spurned spouse, the goddess whose husband could not or would not honor the vows they had exchanged. Yet for all its problems, the marriage endured. Zeus and Hera remained bound to each other, unable or unwilling to dissolve the union they had created. Their relationship became a central drama of Olympian life, affecting gods and mortals alike as Hera pursued Zeus's lovers and their children across the world. The queen who had been courted with such care became the avenger whose wrath was feared throughout the cosmos. This transformation from bride to avenger, from beloved to bitter spouse, from partner to antagonist, happened gradually over time. But its roots could be traced back to the earliest violations of Zeus's promises, to the first affair that Hera discovered, to the first time she realized that the marriage she had negotiated so carefully was not the marriage she was actually going to have. The stage was set for the jealousy myths that would dominate Hera's mythology. The queen was in her place, crowned and powerful, but the king was already looking elsewhere, his attention wandering to other women, his promises proving as insubstantial as the clouds he commanded. And Hera, trapped in a marriage she could not leave and could not fix, would find other ways to express her rage and to assert her dignity in the face of repeated humiliation. The jealousy myths, Semele and the birth of Dionysus among all the women Zeus pursued, few met a more horrific end than Semele, the princess of Thebes. Her story stands as perhaps the most cunning example of Hera's indirect vengeance, a tale where the queen of the gods used words rather than magic to destroy her rival. Semele was the daughter of Cadmus, the founder of Thebes, and Harmonia, who was herself the daughter of Ares and Aphrodite. This made Semele a woman of exceptional lineage, descended from both gods and heroes. She was known throughout Thebes for her beauty and grace, qualities that would ultimately prove to be her undoing when they caught the attention of Zeus. Zeus, as was his habit, became infatuated with the young princess. He came to her in secret, visiting her chamber under cover of darkness, and the two began an affair. For a time, their relationship remained hidden from both mortal eyes and divine awareness. Semele believed herself blessed beyond measure, chosen by the king of the gods himself as a lover and companion. But secrets among the gods rarely remain secret for long. Hera, ever vigilant for signs of her husband's infidelity, eventually learned of the affair. What made matters worse, from Hera's perspective, was that Semele had become pregnant with Zeus's child. This was not merely another conquest to be forgotten. This was evidence, growing larger by the day in Semele's womb, of Zeus's betrayal. Hera's rage at this discovery was profound, but rather than act immediately through raw divine power, she chose a more subtle and devastating approach. She would not simply punish Semele. She would make the woman's own desires and doubts the instrument of her destruction. Hera descended to Thebes and disguised herself as an old woman, taking on the appearance of Bero, Semele's elderly nurse, according to the poet Ovid's account of this myth. In this guise, she gained easy access to the princess's chambers and her confidence. The two women spent time together, and Hera listened as Semele spoke of her divine lover, of the visits he paid her, of the promises he had made. Then, with careful precision, Hera planted seeds of doubt in Semele's mind. "My dear child," the disguised goddess said, her voice filled with concerned affection, "how can you be certain that your lover is truly Zeus? Many men have claimed divinity to seduce innocent young women. How do you know he is not simply a mortal man, taking advantage of your trust?" At first, Semele protested. She knew Zeus, had felt his power, had seen evidence of his divine nature. But Hera was patient and persistent. Day after day she returned, each time adding new layers to her argument. "If he truly loves you," Hera suggested, "if he is truly the king of the gods, then surely he would not hide himself from you. Surely he would appear to you as he appears to his wife, in his full glory and majesty. The poison worked slowly but effectively. Semele, who had been so certain of her lover's identity, began to question. The doubts grew, fed by Hera's carefully chosen words and by Semele's own isolation. She was pregnant with a child she claimed was fathered by Zeus, but what proof did she have? What if others thought she was lying? What if her own family doubted her? When Zeus next visited, Semele was ready with a request. She asked him to grant her a single boon, anything she desired. Zeus, happy in her company and eager to please her, swore a sacred oath on the river Styx that he would grant whatever she asked. This was no light promise. An oath sworn on the Styx bound even the gods absolutely. There was no way to break it, no escape from its terms. Only then did Semele make her request. She asked Zeus to reveal himself to her in his true form, to appear before her as he appeared before Hera, with all his divine glory and power on full display. She framed it as a test of his love, a proof of his divinity that would silence all doubts. Zeus's reaction was immediate horror. He begged her to reconsider, to ask for anything else. He tried to explain that no mortal could look upon a god in their true form and survive. The divine essence, the radiance and power of the gods in their unveiled state, was too much for mortal flesh to withstand. It would destroy her. But Semele, driven by the doubts Hera had so carefully cultivated, insisted. She reminded Zeus of his oath, sworn on the Styx. She accused him of lying, of not truly being Zeus at all. Her voice rose with each protest from him, her certainty growing that his reluctance proved the truth of Hera's warnings. Zeus found himself trapped by his own promise. An oath on the Styx could not be broken, not even by the king of the gods. If he refused, the consequences would be catastrophic, undermining the very foundation of divine law and order. With deep reluctance and growing dread, Zeus agreed to honor his word. He tried to minimize the danger. He called upon only a fraction of his power. He gathered the smallest thunderclouds he could find. He wielded the weakest lightning bolts in his arsenal. But even this reduced display was more than any mortal could endure. When Zeus revealed his true form to Semele, the result was instantaneous and terrible. The divine fire, the lightning that coursed through his being, the sheer overwhelming presence of divinity unmasked, struck Semele like a physical blow. Her mortal body could not contain or withstand the experience. She burst into flames, consumed in an instant by the radiance of the god she had loved. Zeus, stricken with grief and horror at what had transpired, managed to save one thing from the catastrophe. Semele was 6 months pregnant when she died, and Zeus reached into the flames and retrieved the unborn child from her womb. The infant, impossibly, had survived the conflagration that had consumed its mother. To save the child and complete the pregnancy, Zeus performed one of the most unusual acts recorded in Greek mythology. He cut open his own thigh and sewed the fetus inside, creating a makeshift womb within his own flesh. For the next 3 months, Zeus carried the child, enduring the discomfort and the strangeness of the situation. When the time came, the child was born from Zeus's thigh, fully formed and healthy. This child was Dionysus, who would become the god of wine, theatre, and religious ecstasy. His unusual birth, from both a mortal woman and from Zeus himself, gave him a unique nature. He was called the twice-born god, and his very existence stood as a testament to both Zeus's love for Semele and the terrible price she had paid for that love. Hera's vengeance against Semele had been perfectly executed. She had not struck the woman down directly, which might have invited criticism or retaliation from Zeus. Instead, she had used Semele's own doubts and desires, planted and nurtured through careful manipulation, to bring about her destruction. Zeus himself had been the instrument of Semele's death, bound by his own oath and his own divine nature to do the very thing that would kill his lover. The cruelty of this approach was breathtaking in its sophistication. Hera had turned Zeus's love into a weapon, his divine power into poison, his oath into a death sentence. And she had done it all while appearing to be nothing more than a concerned old woman, planting seeds of wisdom and caution in a young woman's mind. The story of Semele became a cautionary tale told throughout Greece. It spoke to the dangers of desiring too much, of seeking to cross the boundaries between mortal and divine. It illustrated the terrible price that mortals paid when they became entangled in the affairs of the gods. And it demonstrated, once again, that Hera's vengeance was as inventive as it was merciless. But the story did not end with Semele's death. Years later, after Dionysus had grown to adulthood and had been accepted among the Olympian gods, he performed an act of filial devotion that was rare in Greek mythology. He descended into the underworld, into the realm of Hades, and brought his mother back from death. Semele, restored to life, was transformed into the goddess Thy One and given a place on Mount Olympus. This resurrection added another layer to the complex mythology surrounding Hera and Zeus's affairs. Despite Hera's best efforts, despite the complete success of her plan to destroy Semele, the woman ultimately achieved immortality and divine status. One wonders how Hera reacted when Semele, renamed Thy One, took her place among the gods. Did she protest? Did she accept it as Zeus's right to elevate whomever he chose? The myths do not tell us, leaving that particular confrontation to our imagination. What is clear is that the story of Semele illustrated several key aspects of Hera's character and her approach to dealing with her husband's infidelities. She was patient, willing to take the time to craft the perfect revenge rather than acting in hot anger. She was cunning, understanding human psychology well enough to manipulate Semele's thoughts and emotions with precision. And she was utterly ruthless, willing to destroy an innocent woman to punish Zeus for his transgression and to assert her own authority and dignity. Leto and the Wandering Birth, if Semele's story demonstrated Hera's skill at indirect manipulation, the persecution of Leto showed her capacity for sustained, relentless cruelty that extended over months and targeted not just Zeus's lover, but her unborn children as well. Leto's suffering was prolonged and public, a display of Hera's power that sent a clear message to all who might attract Zeus's attention. Leto was a Titaness, one of the earlier generation of divine beings who had lived through the Titanomachy. She was the daughter of the Titan Zeus, associated with intelligent inquiry, and Phoebe, connected with prophetic wisdom. This lineage made her a being of considerable power and dignity in her own right, not some powerless nymph or mortal woman who could be easily dismissed. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, when Zeus turned his attention to Leto and she became pregnant with his children, Hera's response was swift and comprehensive. The Queen of the Gods decreed that no land under the sun would be permitted to offer Leto shelter when the time came for her to give birth. Any place that defied this command would face Hera's eternal wrath. This was a curse of extraordinary scope and cruelty. Leto, feeling the first pangs of labor, began to wander across the earth seeking some place, any place, where she might bring her children into the world. But everywhere she went, she was turned away. Islands she approached physically moved away from her as she drew near. Mainland regions closed their borders to her. Mountains denied her their caves. Rivers refused her their banks. The fear of Hera was so great that even places that might have wanted to help Leto dared not do so. Hera had made it clear that any land that gave shelter to her rival would be cursed forever. The goddess had sent Ares and Iris to patrol the earth, driving Leto away from any place where she tried to stop and rest. The persecution was active and comprehensive, leaving Leto no respite from her wandering or her labor. According to some traditions, Hera went even further in her persecution. She sent the monstrous serpent Python, a creature of enormous size and terrible power, to pursue Leto across the earth. Python's orders were to prevent Leto from giving birth or, failing that, to destroy both mother and children. The pregnant Titaness, already exhausted from her wandering and her extended labor, now had to flee from a monster that represented death itself. Making Leto's suffering even worse, Hera took steps to ensure that the birth would be as difficult and painful as possible. Eileithyia was the goddess of childbirth, responsible for easing labor and ensuring safe deliveries. She was also Hera's daughter, and Hera commanded her not to attend Leto under any circumstances. Without Eileithyia's assistance, Leto's labor became prolonged and agonizing, stretching on for days as she continued her desperate search for a place of refuge. The situation seemed hopeless. Leto was exhausted, in constant pain, pursued by monsters, and rejected by every land she encountered. The children in her womb, twins prophesied to become powerful gods, seemed doomed to be born into homelessness and danger, if they were born at all. But finally, Leto found sanctuary in an unexpected place. The island of Delos, floating free in the Aegean Sea, agreed to accept her. According to the myths, Delos was willing to help because, as a floating island not rooted to the earth and not fixed in place, it was not technically land under the sun, as Hera had specified in her curse. It existed in a grey area, able to offer aid without directly violating Hera's decree. But Delos had its own concerns. It was a small, barren rock, with little to recommend it and no particular prominence among the islands of Greece. The island spirit asked Leto for assurance that, if the children were born there, they would remember the island and honor it. Leto, desperate and grateful, made promises. Her son, she swore, would make Delos his sacred place, would build temples there, would ensure that the island became famous and prosperous. With this agreement in place, Leto was finally able to stop running. She grasped a sacred palm tree that grew on the island and, with the sea all around her and the sky stretching overhead, she prepared to give birth. But even here, even at this final moment, Hera's persecution continued. Eileithyia remained held back, prevented from attending the birth by her mother's command. For 9 days and 9 nights, Leto labored without assistance. Her suffering was extreme, her cries echoing across the island and out over the sea. The other goddesses, watching from Olympus, finally took action. They sent Iris, the rainbow messenger, to Eileithyia with a bribe, an offer the goddess of childbirth could not refuse. The goddesses promised Eileithyia a beautiful necklace, wrought of gold and amber, if she would slip away from her mother and attend to Leto in secret. Eileithyia, moved by compassion and tempted by the gift, agreed. She came to Delos without Hera's knowledge, and with her assistance, Leto was finally able to complete the birth. First came Artemis, born quickly and easily. The baby goddess, in a display of her precocious nature, immediately turned around and helped her mother deliver her twin brother, Apollo. This was why Artemis was thereafter associated with childbirth and midwifery, having assisted in a delivery even as a newborn herself. The birth of Apollo and Artemis was a momentous event. The entire island of Delos, previously floating and unstable, became rooted to the sea floor at the moment of Apollo's birth. For great pillars rose from the depths to anchor it in place, a sign of the new god's power and importance. The swans that had circled the island during Leto's labor sang 7 times in celebration, and ever after, Apollo's sacred lyre would have 7 strings in honor of this. All the gods and goddesses, with the notable exception of Hera, gathered on Delos to witness the birth and welcome the twins into the divine family. It was a recognition that, despite Hera's best efforts, these children were meant to exist, were fated to take their place among the Olympians. Hera's persecution had failed in its ultimate goal, though it had certainly caused Leto immense suffering along the way. Leto's ordeal became legendary throughout Greece. The story was told and retold, always with emphasis on her suffering and her perseverance, on her determination to bring her children safely into the world despite all obstacles. She became a symbol of maternal strength and devotion, a Titaness who had endured persecution by the Queen of the Gods and emerged victorious, her children born and safe. Delos, as Leto had promised, became one of the most sacred sites in all of Greece. Apollo established his primary oracle there, and the island attracted pilgrims from across the Greek world. What had been a barren, floating rock became one of the most important religious centers of the ancient world, its temple and treasuries filled with offerings from grateful worshippers. Leto's promise had been fulfilled many times over, but the cost of this victory had been high. Leto had suffered months of wandering, 9 days of agonizing labor, and the terror of being pursued by monsters while pregnant and vulnerable. Her suffering was meant to serve as a warning to other women who might attract Zeus's attention, a demonstration that even a Titaness, a being of divine power in her own right, could be brought low by Hera's wrath. The myth also revealed something important about the limits of Hera's power and the workings of fate in Greek mythology. Despite all her efforts, despite marshalling her considerable divine authority to prevent the birth, Hera could not ultimately stop Apollo and Artemis from being born. They were fated to exist, destined to become major Olympian deities, and no amount of persecution could change that fundamental reality. This was a recurring pattern in Hera's stories. She could cause immense suffering, could make the lives of Zeus's lovers and their children miserable, could exact terrible vengeance for perceived slights. But she could not fundamentally alter fate or prevent those who were destined for greatness from eventually achieving it. Her power, vast though it was, had limits, and sometimes those limits must have been a source of frustration for the Queen of the Gods, watching as her carefully executed revenge plans ultimately failed to prevent the very outcomes she most sought to avoid. Leto, for her part, became known throughout Greek mythology as a gentle and protective mother, fiercely devoted to her children and always ready to defend them. Perhaps the ordeal she had endured to bring them into the world had created an especially strong bond between mother and children. Certainly, Apollo and Artemis were quick to defend their mother's honor whenever it was challenged. When the mortal queen Niobe boasted that she was superior to Leto because she had borne 14 children to Leto's 2, Apollo and Artemis slew all of Niobe's offspring in retaliation, leaving the arrogant queen weeping over the bodies of her dead children. The story of Leto and her wandering birth thus served multiple purposes in Greek mythology. It demonstrated Hera's capacity for sustained, systematic persecution. It showed the high cost that Zeus's lovers paid for his attentions. It illustrated the power of maternal devotion and the rewards of perseverance in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles. And it raised questions about the nature of divine justice, about whether Hera's treatment of Leto was justified punishment for an affair or cruel persecution of an innocent party in Zeus's infidelities. These questions, like so many in Greek mythology, were left for the listeners and readers to ponder for themselves. The myths presented the stories, often in multiple versions with varying details, but they rarely provided simple moral judgments. Was Hera right to punish Leto? Was she wrong? Could her actions be understood as a legitimate defense of her marriage and her dignity, or were they excessive and cruel? The myths offer no clear answers, only the stories themselves and the invitation to think deeply about the complex relationships between power, justice, love, and revenge. Callisto. The Bear and the Stars, the story of Callisto provided yet another variation on the theme of Hera's jealous vengeance, one that involved transformation, a confused identity, and an ending written in the stars themselves. Like so many of Zeus's victims and lovers, Callisto paid dearly for attracting the attention of the king of the gods, and Hera ensured that her suffering would be comprehensive and lasting. Callisto was, according to most traditions, the daughter of Lycaon, the king of Arcadia. She was renowned for her beauty and her skill as a huntress, qualities that led her to become one of the companions of Artemis. The virgin goddess had a select band of attendants, young women who swore oaths of chastity and devoted themselves to the hunt. Callisto was one of these, and she was said to be among Artemis's favorites, a particularly skilled and devoted follower. The vows of chastity taken by Artemis's companions were no light matter. They were sacred pledges, violations of which could bring severe punishment. But Zeus, seeing Callisto during one of her hunts, desired her and cared nothing for her vows or her dedication to Artemis. He determined to have her, regardless of the obstacles. Different versions of the myth describe Zeus's approach to Callisto in different ways. Some say he came to her in his own form, using his divine authority and power to overcome her resistance. But the more common and more disturbing tradition holds that Zeus disguised himself as Artemis. He took on the exact form of the virgin goddess, appearing to Callisto as her beloved mistress and friend. Trusting that she was with Artemis, Callisto was caught off guard when Zeus revealed his true identity and forced himself upon her. The violation was both physical and emotional, a betrayal not just by Zeus but seemingly by Artemis herself, though of course the goddess had nothing to do with Zeus's deception. Callisto, traumatized and confused, found herself pregnant with Zeus's child. She tried to hide her condition from Artemis and the other huntresses, but as the pregnancy progressed, concealment became impossible. The moment of discovery came when the group stopped to bathe in a cool stream. As the women undressed, Callisto's pregnant belly became visible to all. There was no way to hide it, no explanation she could give that would preserve her place in Artemis's retinue. Artemis's reaction was one of fury and betrayal. One of her most devoted followers had broken her sacred vow of chastity. That the breaking was not voluntary, that Callisto had been deceived and assaulted, seems not to have mattered to the goddess. In Artemis's eyes, the vow was broken, and Callisto was no longer worthy to remain among her companions. She expelled Callisto from the group, casting her out to face her fate alone. Alone, pregnant, and far from home, Callisto might have hoped that her suffering was at an end. But Hera, learning of yet another of Zeus's conquests, decided that punishment was necessary. In some versions of the myth, Hera herself transformed Callisto into a bear. In others, Zeus attempted to hide Callisto from Hera by changing her form, but Hera saw through the deception. Either way, Callisto found herself trapped in the body of a bear, unable to speak or to communicate her true identity to anyone who might have helped her. She retained her human mind and awareness, but she was locked in an animal form, forced to live as a beast in the forests of Arcadia. It was a cruel transformation, leaving her aware of what she had lost but unable to do anything about it. Callisto, in her bear form, gave birth to a son in the wilderness. The child, named Arcus, was taken from her. He was raised by others, growing up without knowing his mother or understanding his strange heritage as the son of Zeus and a woman who was now a bear. Callisto could only watch from a distance as her son grew, unable to reveal herself or to claim him as her own. Years passed. Arcus grew into a young man, skilled in hunting like his mother before him. One day, while hunting in the forests of Arcadia, he encountered a large bear. The bear, recognizing her son even after all this time, approached him. But Arcus, not knowing that the bear was his mother, saw only a dangerous wild animal. He drew his spear, ready to make the kill. At this critical moment, Zeus intervened. Whether motivated by lingering affection for Callisto, by concern for Arcus, or by some other impulse, Zeus prevented the tragedy that was about to occur. He reached down from Olympus and, in an instant, transformed both mother and son. He placed them in the night sky as constellations, where they would circle each other for eternity. Callisto became Ursa Major, the Great Bear, one of the most prominent constellations in the northern sky. Arcus became Ursa Minor, the Little Bear, forever near his mother in the heavens. It was a form of immortality, a preservation of their story for all who looked up at the night sky to see and remember. But even this mercy was not the end of Hera's vengeance. The Queen of the Gods, seeing Callisto granted a place among the stars, was not satisfied. She went to Tethys and Oceanus, the ancient Titans who ruled over the world's waters. She demanded that they never allow the constellations of the Bears to dip below the horizon and refresh themselves in the sea, as other constellations did. Tethys and Oceanus, perhaps fearing Hera or perhaps simply agreeing with her, granted this request. As a result, in the regions where Hera was worshipped, the constellation of Ursa Major appears to circle the North Star endlessly, never setting below the horizon, never able to rest in the cooling waters of the ocean. It was Hera's way of ensuring that Callisto's punishment would continue even in her transformed state, that she would be denied the refreshment and rest that other celestial beings enjoyed. The story of Callisto, like those of Semele and Leto, demonstrated several consistent patterns in Hera's mythology. First, the Queen of the Gods made no real distinction between willing and unwilling participants in Zeus's affairs. Callisto had not sought Zeus's attention and had, in fact, taken a sacred vow to remain chaste. But this mattered nothing to Hera, who saw only another woman who had been intimate with her husband, regardless of the circumstances. Second, Hera's punishments often involved transformation and isolation. Io became a cow. Callisto became a bear. These transformations stripped the women of their humanity, their ability to communicate, their place in society. They were cut off from everything they had known, forced to live as beasts while retaining their human consciousness and memories. It was a psychological torture as much as a physical one. Third, Hera's vengeance extended beyond the immediate situation. Even after Callisto was placed in the stars, even after she had been removed entirely from the mortal world and from any possibility of further contact with Zeus, Hera continued to punish her by denying her rest in the ocean. The queen's anger was not easily satisfied, and her memory was very long. The myth of Callisto also became an etiological story, explaining the existence and behavior of certain constellations. The ancient Greeks, looking up at the night sky, saw the patterns of stars that we still call the Great Bear and the Little Bear. They knew that these constellations circled the North Star and, in their latitude, never set below the horizon. The story of Callisto and Arcus provided a mythological explanation for these astronomical observations, connecting the movements of the heavens to the stories of gods and mortals on earth. Moreover, Callisto's transformation into a bear had symbolic significance beyond the immediate circumstances of her story. Bears were powerful and dangerous creatures, but they were also known for their maternal devotion and fierce protection of their young. By becoming a bear, Callisto was in some sense embodying the maternal qualities that had driven her to approach Arcus in the forest, even knowing the danger. The bear form was fitting for a mother seeking her lost child, even if that seeking nearly led to tragedy. The presence of Artemis in the story also added layers of complexity. The virgin goddess, known for her protection of women and her assistance in childbirth, expelled one of her own followers rather than investigating the circumstances of her pregnancy. Artemis, in this myth, appeared harsh and unforgiving, more concerned with the letter of the law than with justice or compassion. This was consistent with other myths about Artemis, who could be as quick to punish as to protect, but it raised questions about what kind of protection the goddess truly offered to her followers. And what of Zeus in all this? He violated Callisto through deception, impregnated her against her will, and then apparently did nothing as Hera transformed her into a bear and Artemis cast her out. Only at the last moment, when Arcus was about to kill his own mother, did Zeus finally intervene. His role in the story was far from heroic, but neither did he face any real consequences for his actions. Callisto bore all the punishment, all the suffering, all the loss. This pattern, repeated across multiple myths, reflected Greek society's double standards regarding male and female behavior. Zeus could pursue any woman he desired, face minimal consequences for his actions, and even be praised for the powerful children he fathered. The women, willing or not, suffered transformation, exile, persecution, and pain. Hera, as the enforcer of these punishments, served as a kind of divine embodiment of societal judgment, directing her wrath at women rather than at her husband, who was the true source of the problem. Yet for all this, the story of Callisto also carried a thread of hope. She was placed among the stars, given a form of immortality, forever visible in the night sky. Her son was with her, circling nearby through eternity, and her story was remembered, told and retold, a reminder of the complicated relationships between gods and mortals, between power and justice, between punishment and mercy. Hera's protection. The story of Jason and the Argonauts. Not all of Hera's interventions in mortal affairs were motivated by jealousy or vengeance. The Queen of the Gods could also be a powerful protector and patron, as demonstrated by her crucial role in the quest of Jason and the Argonauts for the Golden Fleece. This story showed a different side of Hera's character, one that revealed her capacity for loyalty, strategic thinking, and even compassion when her sense of justice was engaged. The story began not with Jason, but with his uncle Peleus, who had usurped the throne of Iolcus that rightfully belonged to Jason's father Eson. Peleus was a cruel and impious ruler, and among his many crimes was one that particularly offended Hera. He had killed his stepmother Sidero, chasing her into one of Hera's temples and slaying her at the altar even as she clung to the sacred image of the goddess for protection. This was a violation of one of the most fundamental rules of Greek religious life. Temples were sanctuaries, places where even criminals and enemies could find temporary refuge. To kill someone at an altar, in the very presence of the divine image, was an act of supreme sacrilege. It showed contempt not just for the victim, but for the god whose sacred space had been defiled with blood and violence. Hera did not forget this offense. She waited and watched for an opportunity to punish Peleus, but as a goddess, she could not simply strike him down directly. Divine intervention in mortal affairs had to follow certain rules, had to work through mortal agents and natural consequences rather than overt displays of supernatural power that might upset the cosmic order. Her opportunity came when Jason, now grown to adulthood, decided to reclaim his inheritance. He traveled to Iolcus to confront Peleus and demand the return of his father's throne. On the way, he came to a river swollen with winter rains. An old woman stood at the riverbank, unable to cross the swift current on her own. She begged Jason for help. Despite the fact that helping her would delay his important journey, despite the inconvenience and the risk, Jason agreed without hesitation. He lifted the old woman onto his back and waded into the river. The current was strong, the water cold, and midway across, Jason lost one of his sandals. But he continued, carrying the old woman safely to the far bank before continuing on his way, now wearing only one sandal. What Jason did not know was that the old woman had been Hera in disguise. The goddess had come down from Olympus specifically to test him, to see what kind of man he was. Would he help someone weaker than himself, even when it cost him time and effort? Would he show kindness to a stranger without thought of reward? Jason had passed the test, and Hera decided that he would be her instrument for punishing Peleus. When Jason arrived in Iolcus and presented himself at the palace, wearing only one sandal, Peleus felt a chill of fear. Years earlier, an oracle had warned him that a man wearing only one sandal would come to take his throne. Now that man stood before him, and Peleus knew that his reign was under threat. Rather than simply refusing Jason's claim or having him killed, which might have provoked a revolt among the people who remembered Jason's father, Peleus came up with what he thought was a perfect solution. He told Jason that he would willingly give up the throne, but only if Jason first performed a great feat that would prove his worthiness to rule. Jason must travel to Colchis, on the far eastern shores of the Black Sea, and retrieve the golden fleece that hung in the sacred grove of Ares. This was meant to be an impossible task. The journey to Colchis was long and fraught with danger. The king of Colchis, Eets, was a powerful sorcerer and the son of Helios the sun god. He would never willingly give up the golden fleece, and he had placed it under guard of a dragon that never slept, a serpent so large and terrible that no warrior could hope to defeat it in direct combat. Peleus expected Jason to die in the attempt, solving the problem of his rival without the need for direct confrontation. But Peleus had not accounted for Hera's protection. The goddess decided to help Jason succeed in his quest, not because she cared particularly about Jason himself, but because his success would lead to Peleus's downfall. Hera began working behind the scenes, manipulating events and people to give Jason the best possible chance of success. First, Hera inspired Jason to build a magnificent ship, the Argo, and to gather the greatest heroes of Greece to accompany him on the voyage. The ship itself incorporated a beam from the sacred oak tree of Dodona, one of Hera's oracle sites. This beam could speak with her voice, providing guidance and prophecy to the Argonauts during their journey. The crew Jason assembled was extraordinary. Heracles, the strongest man in the world, agreed to come. Orpheus, whose music could charm even stones, joined the expedition. Castor and Polydeuces, the divine twins, lent their skills. Atalanta, the great huntress, was among the heroes, as was Theseus of Athens. Nearly every great hero of that generation took part in the quest for the Golden Fleece, and their presence on the ship was a testament to Jason's leadership and to the importance of the mission. Throughout the long journey to Colchis, Hera watched over the Argonauts. When they encountered the clashing rocks, two massive cliffs that smashed together to crush any ship that tried to pass between them, Hera sent helpful winds to speed the Argo through at just the right moment. When storms threatened to capsize the ship, she calmed the seas. When the Argonauts faced attacks from various monsters and hostile peoples, she provided subtle assistance, guiding them to safety. But Hera's most important intervention came when the Argonauts finally reached Colchis. Jason had arrived at the court of King Eets and had been set a series of seemingly impossible tasks. To earn the Golden Fleece, he would have to yoke 2 fire-breathing bulls with bronze hooves, plough a field with them, and sow the field with dragons' teeth that would spring up as armed warriors. He would have to defeat these warriors in combat, and then somehow get past the sleepless dragon that guarded the fleece itself. Hera realized that Jason, skilled though he was, could not accomplish these tasks without help. What he needed was magic, powerful sorcery that could protect him from the bull's fire, give him strength beyond human limits, and put the guardian dragon to sleep. And Hera knew exactly where to find such magic. Medea, the daughter of King Eets, was a powerful sorceress and a priestess of Hecate, goddess of witchcraft. She possessed the knowledge and skill to help Jason, but she had no reason to do so. Jason was a foreigner, a stranger seeking to steal her father's greatest treasure. Why would she betray her father and her kingdom to help him? This was where Hera's plan became truly sophisticated. She enlisted the help of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and Aphrodite's son Eros, the archer god whose arrows caused irresistible desire. Together, they arranged for Eros to shoot Medea with one of his arrows at the exact moment when she first laid eyes on Jason. The effect was instantaneous. Medea, who had been preparing to watch Jason fail and die in his attempts to complete her father's tasks, instead found herself overwhelmed by love for the stranger. Every rational thought, every loyalty to her family and homeland, was swept away by the magical compulsion of Eros's arrow. She could think of nothing but Jason, of helping him, of winning his love in return. Medea went to Jason in secret and offered her assistance. She gave him a magical ointment that would protect him from the bull's fire and give him supernatural strength. She told him how to defeat the warriors that would spring from the dragon's teeth by throwing a stone among them, making them turn on each other in confusion. And she promised that, when the time came, She would use her sorcery to put the guardian dragon to sleep, so Jason could take the golden fleece. In return, Jason had to swear an oath to take Medea as his wife and never betray her. Jason, desperate and seeing no other way to succeed, gladly swore the oath. With Medea's help, he completed all the tasks set before him. He yoked the fire-breathing bulls and ploughed the field. He defeated the dragon-tooth warriors. And finally, guided by Medea's magic, he put the sleepless dragon into a deep slumber and removed the golden fleece from its place in the sacred grove. With the fleece in hand and Medea at his side, Jason and the Argonauts fled from Colchis, pursued by Aetes and his forces. Even during this desperate escape, Hera's protection remained with them. She sent favorable winds that sped the Argo away from danger. She guided them on a safe route home, avoiding many of the hazards they had faced on their outward journey. She ensured that they made it back to Iolcus with the golden fleece, completing the quest that Peleus had thought impossible. When Jason returned and presented the golden fleece to Peleus, the usurper king realized that he had lost. He had promised to give up the throne if Jason completed the task, but he had never expected Jason to actually succeed. Now he was faced with a choice: honor his word and step down, or reveal himself as an oath-breaker by refusing. Peleus chose to break his oath, but Hera was not finished with him. Working through Medea, whose sorcery remained available to Jason, the goddess arranged for Peleus to meet an appropriate end. The details vary in different versions of the myth, but in all of them, Peleus paid for his crimes, particularly for his defilement of Hera's temple. The goddess had been patient, working through mortal agents and natural consequences, but her vengeance was no less certain for being delayed. The story of Jason and the Argonauts thus showed Hera in a very different light than the jealous goddess of the earlier myths. Here she was a planner and protector, working systematically over a long period to achieve a goal that was rooted in her sense of justice rather than in personal jealousy. She protected Jason not because she had any particular affection for him, but because he served her purpose of punishing Peleus for his sacrilege. This version of Hera, the goddess who rewarded those who showed her respect and punished those who defied her, was probably closer to how she was actually worshipped in ancient Greece. The common people who prayed to Hera were not concerned with Zeus's affairs or divine marriage troubles. They saw her as a powerful protector who valued loyalty, honor, and respect for the sacred. They believed she would help those who maintained these values and destroy those who violated them. The myth also demonstrated Hera's sophistication in achieving her goals. She did not simply appear to Jason and announce that she would help him. She tested him first, in disguise, to ensure he had the qualities she valued. She assembled a team of heroes to support him, understanding that even with divine protection, mortal agents needed mortal companions. She manipulated emotions and circumstances through Aphrodite and Eros, recognizing that the right love affair at the right time could be more powerful than any direct intervention. And she was patient. The offense that Peleus committed happened years before Jason's quest. Hera waited for the right time, the right circumstances, the right person to serve as her instrument of vengeance. She did not act in hot anger, but in calculated determination, and her revenge, when it finally came, was all the more devastating for being so carefully planned and executed. Yet the story of Jason also illustrated the complicated nature of divine intervention in human affairs. Yes, Jason succeeded in his quest with Hera's help. Yes, Peleus was punished for his crimes. But Medea, manipulated into betraying her father and her homeland by magically induced love, suffered terribly. She became an exile, hated by both her birth family and eventually by Jason himself, whom she had helped at such great cost. The quest succeeded, but the human consequences rippled out in ways that brought tragedy to many. This was perhaps the ultimate complexity in Hera's character as revealed through the myths. She could be a powerful ally, a skilled strategist, and a source of protection for those who served her purposes. But divine protection came with divine priorities, and mortals caught up in the plans of the gods often found themselves shaped by forces beyond their control, directed toward ends they might not have chosen for themselves. Jason, in the end, would face the consequences of breaking his oath to Medea, the very oath that Hera had made him swear. When he abandoned Medea to marry another woman, thinking to improve his political position, he lost Hera's protection. The goddess who had guided him through so many dangers withdrew her favor, and Jason's life descended into tragedy and failure. Hera, it seemed, valued oaths and loyalty as much when heroes swore them to mortal women as when they were sworn to gods. Symbols, powers, and sacred animals. To fully understand Hera as she was worshipped and revered in ancient Greece, we must examine the symbols, powers, and sacred creatures associated with her. These were not merely decorative elements, but represented fundamental aspects of her divine nature and her relationship with her worshippers. The most iconic symbol of Hera was the peacock, though interestingly, this association came relatively late in Greek history. Peacocks were not native to Greece, but were introduced from the east following the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century before our era. Before that time, Hera had been associated with other birds, but the peacock, with its magnificent tail feathers and proud bearing, seemed to embody the queen of the gods so perfectly that the association became permanent. The connection between Hera and the peacock was given mythological justification through the story of Argus Panoptes, the 100-eyed giant whom Hera had set to guard Io after Zeus had transformed her into a cow. When Hermes slew Argus at Zeus's command, Hera honored her faithful servant by taking his 100 eyes and placing them in the tail feathers of the peacock. This act transformed an ordinary bird into something magnificent and strange, creating a living memorial to Argus's service and Hera's remembrance. The peacock became Hera's sacred bird, appearing in her temples and featuring prominently in artistic representations of the goddess. Peacocks were allowed to roam freely in the grounds of her sanctuaries, their calls echoing through the sacred spaces. When the bird spread its tail in that characteristic fan of colored feathers, ancient Greeks saw not just natural beauty but the eyes of Argus, forever watching, forever vigilant. The peacock represented Hera's watchfulness over marriage and family, her awareness of all that transpired in the mortal and divine worlds, and her tendency to remember both service and slight. But before the peacock, Hera had been associated with the cuckoo bird. This connection went back to the story of Zeus's courtship of his sister. According to the myth, Zeus transformed himself into a bedraggled cuckoo, shivering and wet from a storm. Hera, moved by pity for the small bird, took it into her arms to warm it. Only then did Zeus reveal his true form and declare his love for her. The cuckoo thus represented the beginning of divine marriage, the moment when Hera's compassion led to the most important union in all of Olympus. Cuckoos appeared on Hera's scepter in many of her cult images, perched atop the staff as a reminder of this courtship. The bird, though small and seemingly vulnerable, had been the disguise of the most powerful god in the cosmos. It served as a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that vulnerability could be a strategy, and that even the queen of the gods had once been moved by compassion for a creature in distress. Beyond birds, Hera was strongly associated with the cow. The ancient Greeks called her cow-eyed, a description that modern readers often find puzzling or even unflattering. But to the Greeks, this was high praise. Cows were valuable animals, essential to agriculture and prosperity. Their large, dark eyes were seen as beautiful and soulful. To call Hera cow-eyed was to emphasize her beauty and her maternal nature, to connect her with the nurturing abundance of domestic animals. This bovine association ran deep in Hera's mythology. Before the classical period, there is evidence that Hera may have been worshipped in cow form or with cow attributes in some regions. Her connection to the cow linked her to fertility, to motherhood, to the sustaining power of the earth itself. It also connected her, interestingly, to Io, the priestess whom Zeus transformed into a cow. Some scholars have suggested that the myth of Io might preserve memories of an even earlier time when Hera and Io were different aspects of the same goddess, both represented by the sacred cow. The pomegranate was another important symbol of Hera. This fruit, with its crown-like top and its countless seeds hidden within, represented marriage and fertility. A woman who ate pomegranate seeds was thought to be blessed with many children. The fruit appeared in Hera's hand in many artistic representations, and pomegranate motifs decorated her temples and altars. The symbolism was clear. Hera presided over the fruitfulness of marriage, over the creation of families, over the generation of new life within the proper bounds of matrimony. The diadem or crown was Hera's most obvious symbol of authority. She was almost always depicted wearing a crown, usually a polos, a tall cylindrical crown that was associated with goddesses and queens. This crown marked her as the Queen of Olympus, the ruler who sat beside Zeus and shared in the governance of both gods and mortals. The crown was not merely decorative but a statement of power, a visible representation of her royal status. Her scepter was another symbol of rule. Like Zeus, Hera carried a staff that represented her authority to command and to judge. The scepter was usually topped with a cuckoo bird or a lotus flower, combining her personal mythology with symbols of purity and renewal. When Hera raised her scepter, gods and mortals alike paid attention, for it signaled that the queen was about to issue a decree or make a judgment. The veil was a more subtle but equally important symbol. Hera was often depicted veiled, particularly in her role as the goddess of marriage. The veil represented modesty, the proper behavior of a married woman, and the sanctity of the marriage bond. When brides wore veils in ancient Greek weddings, they were imitating Hera, the divine prototype of the married woman. The veil also symbolized the separation between the sacred and the profane, the mystery and dignity that surrounded proper marriage. As for Hera's powers, they were extensive and multifaceted. As queen of the gods, she shared in Zeus's rule over Olympus and had authority to command the other deities, though this authority was sometimes contested and always conditional on circumstances. She could not overrule Zeus directly, but she could influence him, manipulate situations, and make her will known in ways that even the king of the gods found difficult to ignore. Hera's primary domain was marriage and the protection of married women. She had the power to bless marriages with fertility and happiness, or to curse them with strife and barrenness. Women prayed to her for help in conceiving children, for protection during childbirth, and for harmony in their marriages. She was seen as the guardian of the marriage bond, punishing adultery and infidelity while rewarding faithfulness and devotion. Her control over the air and the lower atmospheric regions gave her power over weather, though not to the same extent as Zeus. She could not wield thunderbolts or command the storm in the way her husband could, but she could influence winds and rains, calm or stir the air, and use the atmosphere as a means of communication and travel. When Hera moved between Olympus and the mortal world, she flew through the air, often in a chariot drawn by peacocks or by horses. Hera possessed formidable powers of transformation. She could change her own appearance, as she did when she disguised herself as an old woman to deceive Semele. She could transform others into animals or objects, as she did with Callisto and Io. These transformations were not temporary illusions, but fundamental changes in nature, alterations that could only be undone by equally powerful divine intervention. She had the ability to manipulate emotions and perceptions, working through dreams, visions, and subtle influences on the mind. When Hera wanted someone to believe something or to feel a particular emotion, she could plant suggestions that would grow and flourish in the person's thoughts. This was how she managed to convince Semele to ask Zeus to reveal his true form, by slowly cultivating doubt and curiosity until they overwhelmed the princess's better judgment. Hera could also grant or withhold divine favor in ways that directly affected mortal lives. A king who honored Hera might find his reign peaceful and prosperous, his people content, his borders secure. A ruler who neglected her worship or showed her disrespect might face rebellions, invasions, natural disasters, or other calamities. The same principle applied to individuals. Hera's favor could mean the difference between success and failure, happiness and misery, life and death. Her powers extended to enforcement of oaths and sacred laws. When someone swore an oath in Hera's name, particularly an oath related to marriage or family, she became the enforcer of that oath. Breaking such a promise was not just a social transgression, but a religious crime that would bring her wrath. This made Hera a crucial figure in maintaining social order, as oaths sworn in her name carried real weight and real consequences. Hera also had powers related to sovereignty and rulership. As the divine queen, she could legitimize or delegitimize mortal rulers. Kings claimed to rule with the blessing of both Zeus and Hera, and a king who lost Hera's favor might find his throne becoming unstable. Queens, especially, looked to Hera as their patron and protector, seeing in her the divine model of what a queen should be: dignified, powerful, and commanding respect. Her connection to childbirth gave her power over one of the most critical moments in ancient life. Women in labor prayed to Hera for a safe delivery. Midwives invoked her name. The successful birth of a healthy child, especially a son who would continue the family line, was seen as a blessing from Hera. Conversely, difficulties in childbirth, stillbirths, or infant mortality could be interpreted as signs of her displeasure. All these powers combined to make Hera one of the most important deities in the Greek pantheon, despite the fact that her mythology often portrayed her in a negative light. The Greeks who actually worshipped her did not see her primarily as a jealous wife, but as a powerful protector, a source of blessing for those who honored her and a terrible enemy to those who showed her disrespect. Her temples were well attended, her festivals widely celebrated, and her influence felt throughout Greek society. The sacred temples, architecture of devotion, the physical spaces where Hera was worshipped tell us much about how the ancient Greeks understood and honored their queen of the gods. Her temples were among the most ancient and most important religious structures in the Greek world, and examining them reveals the depth and breadth of her worship. The Heraean of Argos, located about 15 stades from the city of Mycenae, was one of the most ancient and revered sanctuaries of Hera in all of Greece. The site had been sacred to Hera from very early times, possibly going back to the Mycenaean period. The temple itself went through several incarnations over the centuries, each one grander than the last, demonstrating the enduring importance of Hera's worship in the region. The sanctuary was positioned on the lower slopes of Mount Euboea, with the temple facing east to catch the rising sun. A sacred road led from Argos to the temple, and during festivals, great processions of worshippers would walk this road, singing hymns and bringing offerings to the goddess. The approach to the temple would have been impressive, with the building growing larger and more imposing as pilgrims drew closer. Inside the temple stood a magnificent statue of Hera, created by the renowned sculptor Polykleitos. This statue was considered one of the finest representations of the goddess ever made. Hera was depicted seated on a throne, wearing a crown and holding a pomegranate in one hand and a scepter topped with a cuckoo in the other. The statue was chryselephantine, meaning it was constructed with ivory for the flesh and gold for the clothing and details, a technique reserved for only the most important cult images. The throne itself was an artwork, decorated with the graces and the seasons, representing Hera's connection to the cycles of nature and the passage of time. Beneath the throne were carved scenes representing various myths associated with Hera and the Argive region. Every detail of the statue was meaningful, designed to communicate aspects of Hera's nature and power to those who came to worship. The temple also housed numerous votive offerings brought by worshippers over the centuries. These ranged from simple clay figurines left by poor farmers hoping for Hera's blessing on their families to elaborate gold and silver vessels dedicated by wealthy citizens and foreign dignitaries. Each offering represented a prayer, a thanks, a hope, or a plea, creating an accumulation of devotion that filled the temple with spiritual significance. The famous story of Cleobis and Biton took place in connection with this temple. These two young men, when the oxen that were supposed to draw their mother's cart to the temple for a festival failed to arrive in time, yoked themselves to the cart and pulled it the 5 miles from the city to the sanctuary. Their mother, who was a priestess of Hera, was so moved by their devotion that she prayed to the goddess to grant them the greatest gift possible. That night, after they had participated in the festival and feasted, both young men died peacefully in their sleep. Hera had granted them the best fate possible for mortals, a death that came quickly, without pain or decline, at the peak of their strength and virtue, ensuring that they would be remembered with honor. The Heraean of Samos was perhaps even more impressive than its Argive counterpart. Located on the island of Samos, this sanctuary was believed by the Samians to be Hera's birthplace. Local tradition held that the goddess had been born under a sacred Lygos tree near the temple site, and this tree was incorporated into the sanctuary, becoming a focal point of worship. The temple at Samos went through multiple building phases, each more ambitious than the last. The earliest temple on the site was a simple structure, but by the 6th century before our era, the Samians had constructed what was, for its time, one of the largest temples in the Greek world. This temple, designed by the architects Roikos and Theodoros, was an enormous structure supported by over 100 columns, a marvel of archaic Greek architecture. Even this massive temple was eventually destroyed, likely by an earthquake, and replaced by plans for an even larger one, begun during the reign of the tyrant Polycrates. This new temple was designed to be enormous, with dimensions that would have made it one of the largest temples ever built in ancient Greece. The ancient historian Herodotus called it one of the greatest building projects he knew of. However, this grandest temple was never completed. After Polycrates was killed, the work ceased, and the temple remained unfinished throughout antiquity. Even incomplete, however, it dominated the landscape, its massive foundations and standing columns a reminder of the ambitious plans that Samian rulers had for honoring their patron goddess. The sanctuary at Samos was not just a temple, but an entire sacred complex. It included treasuries where valuable offerings were stored, stowers where worshippers could gather and rest, a sacred way connecting the temple to the city, and the great altar where sacrifices were performed. The altar was particularly impressive, a large structure where hundreds of animals could be sacrificed during major festivals. The most distinctive feature of Samian worship was the annual Tunaya festival, during which the cult statue of Hera was ritually bound with branches from the sacred Lygos tree, and then carried in procession to the sea to be washed. This ritual reenacted a mythological event when the statue had supposedly escaped from the temple on its own, only to be found bound in branches by the shore. The binding and washing represented renewal and purification, a way of maintaining the sacred power of the image. At Olympia, the site most famous for the Olympic Games in honor of Zeus, there was also an important temple to Hera. In fact, the temple of Hera was older than the temple of Zeus at Olympia, having been built in the 7th century before our era, making it one of the oldest monumental temples in Greece. This temple was distinctive for its construction. While most Greek temples of the classical period were built entirely of stone, the Heraean at Olympia retained some wooden elements in its structure, a holdover from earlier building techniques. Over time, as wooden columns decayed, they were gradually replaced with stone ones, leading to an interesting situation where the temple had columns of slightly different styles, representing different periods of construction and repair. The temple housed several important items beyond the cult statue of Hera. One was the quoit of Iphitus, a bronze disc inscribed with a sacred truce that was proclaimed before each Olympic Games. Another was a table where the olive crowns for Olympic victors were displayed before being awarded. These connections between Hera's temple and the Olympic Games demonstrated the goddess's importance, even in a sanctuary primarily dedicated to her husband. Every 4th year, in addition to the men's Olympic Games, the Heraea or Heraean Games were held at Olympia in honor of Hera. These were foot races for young unmarried women, divided into 3 age categories. The runners wore a special costume, a short tunic that reached above the knee, with the right shoulder and breast bare. They ran on the Olympic Stadium track, though over a slightly shorter distance than the men's race. Winners of the Heraean Games received olive crowns like the men did, as well as a portion of the cow that was sacrificed to Hera. They also had the right to dedicate statues of themselves with inscriptions of their names in the sanctuary. This was a significant honor, ensuring that their victory would be remembered by future generations. The Games were organized by a committee of 16 women, selected from different cities in the region of Elis. These women were also responsible for weaving a peplos, a special robe, for Hera and for arranging 2 choral dances in honor of Hippodamia and Physcoa. The dances were performances of sacred choreography, movements that told stories and honored the goddess through physical expression. The origins of the Heraean Games were attributed to Hippodamia, who supposedly founded them in gratitude to Hera for her marriage to Pelops. This mythological foundation emphasized the game's connection to marriage and female transitions, suggesting that they served as a kind of coming-of-age ritual for young women. Running in the games may have been a way of demonstrating readiness for marriage, of showcasing physical health and vigor that would be important for childbearing. Beyond these major sanctuaries, Hera was worshipped at numerous other sites throughout the Greek world. At Corinth, at Sparta, at Paracora, on the island of Crete, in cities throughout Asia Minor, temples and shrines to Hera dotted the landscape. Each had its own traditions and practices, but all recognized her as the queen of the gods and the protector of marriage and family. The architecture of these temples, the rituals performed within them, the festivals celebrated in their precincts, all of these created a sacred geography of Hera worship that connected communities throughout the Greek world. A worshipper from Argos visiting Samos would recognize the hymns sung to Hera, even if the local practices differed. A Samian visiting Olympia would understand the significance of the sacrifices performed, even if the details varied from their home practices. This network of temples and sanctuaries made Hera a truly pan-Hellenic deity, worshipped not just in one region but throughout the entire Greek world. Her temples served as centers of community identity, places where people gathered not just to worship but to celebrate festivals, to conduct business, to make important oaths and agreements. The temple was the heart of religious life, but it was also a social and economic center, a place where the sacred and the secular intersected. The Heraea, women's games and sacred races, the Heraean Games deserve more detailed attention, as they represented one of the few opportunities for women to participate in athletic competition in ancient Greece. These games were not merely athletic contests, but sacred rituals that honored Hera, while also serving important social functions related to marriage and female identity. According to the most common tradition, the games were founded by Hippodamia after her marriage to Pelops. Hippodamia had been won in a dramatic chariot race, in which her father, King Oenomaus, had challenged her suitors to race against him. The prize for winning was marriage to Hippodamia and eventually the throne. The penalty for losing was death. Many suitors had tried and failed, their heads displayed as trophies around the palace. Pelops, however, managed to win through a combination of courage, skill, and perhaps some divine assistance and treachery. After her marriage, Hippodamia wanted to thank Hera for helping her escape her father's control and find a husband. She gathered 16 women from nearby cities and organized games in the goddess's honor, establishing a tradition that would continue for centuries. Another tradition claimed that the games were established or reorganized around 580 before our era to settle a dispute between the cities of Elis and Pisa. 16 women were selected, one from each of the regions of Elis, and they were given responsibility for organizing the games and maintaining peace between the feuding cities. This tradition connected the games to Hera's role as a bringer of peace and reconciliation, as a force for unity rather than division. Whatever their actual origins, the Heraean Games became an important institution. They took place every 4 years, like the Olympic Games, though scholars debate whether they occurred at the same time as the men's games or at a separate season. Given ancient Greek customs regarding the separation of men and women, it seems more likely that the events were held entirely separately. The races themselves were organized by age group. The youngest girls ran first, then the middle age group, and finally the oldest competitors. This age-based organization allowed girls of similar development to compete against each other and ensured that the competition was fair. The progression from youngest to oldest also created a kind of narrative structure to the event, showcasing female development from childhood through adolescence to the threshold of marriage. The costume worn by the runners was significant. The short tunic, reaching only to just above the knee, was much shorter than the normal clothing worn by Greek women, which typically reached the ankles. This shorter garment allowed for freer movement. During the race, the bare right shoulder and breast was also unusual, as Greek women normally kept themselves covered. This style of dress was typically associated with male athletes and with male activities like farming or sailing, where freedom of movement was essential. The adoption of this masculine style of dress for the races has led some scholars to interpret the Heraean Games as a kind of ritual cross-dressing, a temporary inversion of normal gender roles that was acceptable in the context of sacred festival. The girls participating in the races were inhabiting a liminal space, no longer children but not yet fully married women. The costume reflected this in-between status, combining elements of male and female dress, just as the participants combined elements of maidenhood and approaching womanhood. The race itself covered approximately 5/6 of the standard Olympic stadium distance, roughly 160 meters. This slightly shorter distance acknowledged that the participants were younger and typically less physically developed than the adult male Olympic athletes. But it was still a significant test of speed and endurance, requiring training and preparation. Winners received several rewards for their victory. They were crowned with olive wreaths, just like male Olympic victors, establishing a parallel between the women's games and the men's that elevated the status of female athletic achievement. They also received a portion of the cow sacrificed to Hera, meat that they could take home to share with their families, providing a tangible benefit from their success. Perhaps most importantly, victors had the right to dedicate statues of themselves in the sanctuary of Hera, with inscriptions bearing their names and cities. This was a form of immortality, ensuring that their names and achievements would be remembered by future generations. Archaeological evidence has confirmed that such statues existed, though few have survived to the present day. The 16 women who organized the games had responsibilities beyond just arranging the races. They also wove a peplos for Hera, a sacred robe that would be presented to the goddess's cult statue. This weaving was itself a sacred act, performed with ritual attention and dedicated to the goddess. The peplos represented the civilization and skill of women, the transformation of raw wool into beautiful cloth through patience and artistry. The women also arranged 2 choral dances as part of the festival. One was the dance of Phiskoa, the other the dance of Hippodamia. These dances told stories through movement, honoring heroines of the past while also celebrating the goddess. Music and dancing were important parts of Greek religious festivals, ways of honoring the gods through beauty and coordinated movement. The entire festival can be understood as a celebration of female achievement and female community within the constraints of ancient Greek society. Women in ancient Greece lived largely separated from men, confined to the domestic sphere with limited opportunities for public recognition or achievement. The Heraean Games created a space where women could demonstrate their abilities, win honors, and achieve a form of fame that was otherwise unavailable to them. The Games also served social functions related to marriage. The races showcased young women to potential suitors and their families, demonstrating their health, beauty, and physical fitness. A girl who won a race proved herself strong and capable, qualities that would be valuable in childbearing and household management. The races were thus a kind of marriage market, though conducted in sacred space and dedicated to the goddess who presided over marriage. At the same time, The games created bonds between women of different cities and regions. The 16 women who organized the event came from different places, and the participants represented various communities. The shared experience of the festival created connections and friendships that crossed political boundaries. In a world where cities were often at war with each other, these peaceful gatherings in honor of Hera provided rare opportunities for different communities to come together in shared celebration. The religious significance of the games was paramount. This was not simply athletic competition but a form of worship, a way of honoring Hera through the dedication of human excellence and effort. The runners were performing a sacred duty, using their bodies to glorify the goddess. The races were prayers made physical, offerings of youth and vigor to the divine queen. Hera as queen, duties and divine governance beyond her role as goddess of marriage and her persecution of Zeus's lovers, Hera held significant responsibilities as Queen of Olympus and the gods. This aspect of her character, sometimes overshadowed by the more dramatic jealousy myths, was crucial to how she was actually understood and worshipped in ancient Greece. As queen, Hera sat beside Zeus on the throne of Olympus. She participated in divine councils, where the gods gathered to make decisions about the governance of the cosmos and the fate of mortals. The ancient sources show her voice carrying weight in these assemblies. Though Zeus had final authority, Hera could argue, persuade, and influence the outcomes of divine deliberations. Other gods understood that gaining Hera's support could be essential to getting Zeus's agreement for any major initiative, a dynamic we see play out repeatedly in the myths. Based on the myths where Hera appears, we can infer that she served as a kind of stabilizing force on Olympus. Zeus, for all his power, could be impulsive and passionate, making decisions based on desire or anger rather than careful consideration. Hera, though certainly capable of her own impulsive actions, often represented a more measured approach in the stories where they interact. This pattern suggests she may have played an important role in tempering Zeus's decisions, even if she could not directly overrule him. The Queen of the Gods also served as a mediator and arbitrator in disputes among the other deities. When gods quarreled over domains or honors, Hera might be called upon to help resolve the conflict. Her position gave her authority to judge and to enforce agreements between other divinities. This role required wisdom, fairness, and the ability to see multiple perspectives, qualities that Hera possessed even if they were not always highlighted in the myths. Hera had particular responsibility for the welfare of women, both divine and mortal. Goddesses who faced difficulties or needed support might appeal to Hera for assistance. Mortal women, especially those of high status like queens and princesses, looked to Hera as their divine patron and protector. She was expected to ensure that women were treated justly, that their rights within marriage were respected, that they received proper honor and protection. This protective role extended to childbirth and child-rearing. Though Artemis and Eileithyia had more direct responsibilities for the actual process of birth, Hera oversaw the entire institution of childbearing within marriage. She blessed unions with fertility, protected pregnant women, and ensured that children born within wedlock received recognition and inheritance rights. In a world where legitimacy was crucial for social status and property rights, Hera's role in defining and protecting legitimate birth was extremely important. Hera also had duties related to sovereignty and political authority. Kings and queens who wished to legitimize their rule sought Hera's blessing alongside Zeus's. A monarch who honored Hera properly could expect divine support for their reign. This might manifest as prosperity, military success, social stability, or divine signs that confirmed their right to rule. Conversely, a ruler who neglected Hera's worship or showed her disrespect might face rebellions, invasions, natural disasters, or other signs of divine displeasure. The Queen of the Gods maintained the dignity and protocol of Olympus. She ensured that proper respect was shown to the divine hierarchy, that Zeus received the honors due to him as king, and that lesser gods and goddesses maintained their proper stations. This role sometimes put her in conflict with ambitious deities, or with Zeus himself when he acted in ways that undermined the dignity of his position. Hera was deeply concerned with maintaining appearances, with ensuring that the gods presented themselves to mortals in ways that inspired respect and awe rather than contempt or ridicule. Hera's queenship also involved practical matters of divine household management. Olympus, like any royal court, required organization and administration. Resources had to be allocated, disputes resolved, ceremonies organized, and visitors received. While we might imagine that gods and goddesses could simply will these things into being, the myths consistently portray divine life as requiring the same kinds of practical management and attention that mortal institutions needed. The queen maintained relationships with important mortal communities. Cities that honored Hera particularly strongly could expect her patronage and protection. She might intervene to help them in times of crisis, send favorable omens to guide their decisions, or bless their rulers and institutions. These relationships between goddess and city created bonds that benefited both parties. The city gained divine protection, while Hera gained worshippers, sacrifices, and honor. Hera's role as queen also involved representing divine marriage as an institution. Her relationship with Zeus, problematic though it was, served as the model for mortal marriages. The expectation was that wives should be loyal and devoted like Hera, even when their husbands strayed. This parallel was not lost on ancient Greek women, who saw in Hera's struggles a reflection of their own experiences and challenges within marriage. At the same time, Hera's power within her marriage demonstrated that wives were not powerless. She could punish Zeus's lovers, could make her displeasure known, could refuse cooperation when Zeus needed her support. She had her own domains of authority that Zeus could not simply override. This showed that marriage, even in its most patriarchal forms, involved negotiation and balance of power between partners. The queen also served as an exemplar of female dignity and self-respect. Despite the humiliations Zeus inflicted on her through his infidelities, Hera never lost her queenly bearing or her sense of her own worth. She did not allow Zeus's behavior to diminish her status or her self-regard. She remained the queen, commanding respect and wielding power, regardless of her husband's actions. This modeled a kind of strength that Greek women could admire and emulate. Hera's governance extended to enforcing divine law and maintaining cosmic order. She punished oath-breakers and treaty violators. She ensured that proper sacrifices were offered to the gods. She watched over the boundaries between mortal and divine, ensuring that humans did not overstep their proper limits. When mortals showed hubris, excessive pride that challenged divine prerogatives, Hera was among the gods most likely to demand punishment. Her enforcement of divine law was particularly strong regarding marriage and family. Adultery, especially by women, might bring down Hera's wrath. Children born outside wedlock might be denied recognition or protection. Violations of the marriage bond could result in divine punishment ranging from infertility to madness to death. Hera's role as protector of marriage included being its fierce enforcer, ensuring that the institution was respected even when individual marriages were troubled. Yet for all her power and authority, Hera faced constraints that limited her ability to govern as she might have wished. She could not overrule Zeus, could not prevent him from fathering children with other women, could not fundamentally alter the patriarchal structure of divine and mortal society. Her power was real but bounded, effective within certain spheres but unable to extend into others. She was a queen, but a queen who served a king, and that relationship defined and limited her authority. This complex position, powerful yet constrained, active yet limited, made Hera a fascinating figure in Greek mythology and religion. She was neither the all-powerful matriarch some might imagine, nor the helpless victim sometimes portrayed in simplified retellings. She was a complex political actor, wielding influence and authority within a system that both empowered and restricted her, using the tools available to her to pursue her goals and to fulfill her responsibilities as Queen of Olympus. Legacy and influence. Hera through the ages, the figure of Hera has cast a long shadow across Western culture, influencing how we think about marriage, queenship, jealousy, and female power. Her myths have been retold and reinterpreted countless times, each age finding new meanings and new relevance in the ancient stories of the Queen of the Gods. In ancient Greece itself, Hera was one of the most widely worshipped deities. Her temples attracted pilgrims from across the Greek world. Her festivals brought communities together in celebration and worship. Women prayed to her at every major transition in their lives, at marriage, at the birth of children, in times of marital difficulty. She was not a distant or abstract deity, but an active presence in daily life, a goddess whose favor and displeasure had direct consequences for human welfare. The Roman world adopted Hera under the name Juno, identifying the Greek queen of the gods with their own indigenous goddess of marriage and sovereignty. Juno became one of the most important deities in the Roman pantheon, worshipped throughout the empire. The month of June, still the most popular time for weddings in many Western cultures, takes its name from Juno, a lasting testament to her association with marriage. Roman Juno, while clearly related to Greek Hera, developed somewhat different characteristics. She was seen as more matronly, more domestic, more focused on the practical aspects of marriage and household management. The jealous, vengeful aspects of her character were somewhat downplayed in favor of her protective and nurturing qualities. This Roman interpretation influenced how later cultures would understand the goddess, creating a bifurcation between Hera, the jealous wife of Greek myth, and Juno, the dignified matron of Roman religion. With the rise of Christianity and the decline of pagan worship, direct veneration of Hera ceased. But her myths continued to be told, preserved in the writings of ancient poets and mythographers that survived through the medieval period. Medieval and Renaissance scholars, rediscovering classical literature, encountered Hera's stories anew and began to interpret them through Christian and classical humanist perspectives. During the Renaissance, Hera became a figure in allegorical and symbolic art. She appeared in paintings and sculptures, often as a representation of regal dignity or legitimate authority. Her peacock became a symbol in Christian art as well, where its eyes were sometimes interpreted as representing the all-seeing eye of God or the watchfulness of the Church. The classical goddess was thus transformed into a Christian symbol, her pagan origins preserved but reinterpreted. The 18th and 19th centuries saw increased scholarly interest in Greek mythology as part of broader studies of classical civilization. Hera became a subject for philologists, archaeologists, and early anthropologists trying to understand ancient Greek religion and society. Her temples were excavated, her myths analyzed, her worship practices reconstructed from fragmentary evidence. This scholarly attention brought Hera back into cultural consciousness, though now as an object of historical study rather than active worship. 19th-century Romantic writers and artists found Hera intriguing as a complex female figure. She appeared in poems, plays, and visual art, often portrayed with sympathy as a wronged wife struggling to maintain her dignity in the face of her husband's serial infidelities. This interpretation reflected contemporary concerns about women's position in marriage and society, projecting Victorian anxieties onto ancient myths. The 20th century brought psychological interpretations of mythology, and Hera became a figure for analysis through Freudian and Jungian frameworks. Carl Jung and his followers saw Hera as an archetype of the anima, representing mature feminine power, the queen aspect of female psychology. Feminist scholars began to examine Hera's myths more critically, noting how they reflected patriarchal structures while also revealing female resistance and agency within those structures. In modern popular culture, Hera has appeared in countless books, films, and television shows adapting Greek mythology. These depictions vary wildly in their interpretation of her character. Some portray her as simply villainous, a one-dimensional jealous shrew. Others attempt more nuanced portrayals, exploring her perspective and the impossible position she occupied as wife to a serially unfaithful husband whom she could neither leave nor effectively control. Contemporary feminism has engaged with Hera in complex ways. Some feminists see her as a problematic figure, a woman who directs her legitimate anger at other women rather than at the man actually responsible for her pain. They note how Hera punishes Zeus's lovers and children rather than Zeus himself, perpetuating patterns of female competition and lateral aggression that benefit patriarchal systems. Other feminist interpretations are more sympathetic, viewing Hera's actions within the context of her limited options. Unable to directly punish Zeus without risking cosmic upheaval, lacking the ability to divorce him or leave Olympus, Hera did what she could with the power she had. Her persecution of Zeus's lovers can be seen as an assertion of her boundaries and dignity, a refusal to passively accept humiliation even if her methods were misdirected. Modern women who identify with Hera often see in her a model of female strength and self-assertion within constrained circumstances. She did not simply accept her situation. She fought back, used her intelligence and her power, made her displeasure known and felt. She maintained her dignity and her sense of self-worth even when her husband publicly humiliated her. For women facing similar situations in their own lives, Hera can represent resilience and refusal to be diminished. The Queen of the Gods has also become a figure in modern discussions of marriage and monogamy. Her myths raise uncomfortable questions about the nature of marriage contracts, about what spouses owe each other, about whether staying in an unhappy marriage shows strength or weakness. Hera chose to remain married to Zeus despite his behavior, but was that choice admirable fidelity or tragic inability to imagine other possibilities? In therapy and self-help literature, Hera energy is sometimes invoked to describe a certain type of feminine power, dignified, regal, focused on commitment and relationship, but potentially rigid and vindictive when boundaries are crossed. Women are encouraged to connect with their inner Hera when they need to assert themselves in relationships or to maintain their dignity in difficult circumstances. The mythology of Hera continues to inspire creative works in the 21st century. Modern novels, poetry, and art reimagine her story, often giving her a voice and perspective that were less prominent in ancient sources. These contemporary retellings frequently emphasize Hera's agency, intelligence, and justified anger, recasting her from villain to complex protagonist navigating an impossible situation. Hera's temples, though no longer active sites of worship, continue to attract visitors as important archaeological sites. The ruins at Olympia, Argos, and Samos draw tourists and scholars interested in ancient Greek religion and culture. Walking among these ancient stones, one can still sense something of the reverence and awe that ancient worshippers felt, even if the goddess herself is no longer believed to dwell there. The academic study of Hera continues to produce new insights and interpretations. Scholars examine her worship practices, analyze variations in her myths across different regions and time periods, and consider what her prominence tells us about ancient Greek society and values. Each generation of scholars brings new questions and methods to the study of this ancient goddess, ensuring that our understanding of her continues to evolve. Perhaps most significantly, Hera remains relevant as a symbol of the complicated relationship between marriage, power, and female identity. Her struggles resonate because they touch on themes that are still very much alive: the challenge of maintaining dignity in difficult relationships, the complex dynamics of marital loyalty and betrayal, the question of how to wield power effectively within constrained circumstances. Conclusion. The Eternal Queen. As we come to the end of our journey through the mythology and worship of Hera, it is worth reflecting on what this ancient goddess can still teach us today. Hera was many things: Queen of the Gods, protector of marriage, fierce avenger, strategic planner, dignified matron, and suffering wife. She contained multitudes, embodying contradictions that made her one of the most complex and compelling figures in Greek mythology. The stories we have explored tonight, from her hidden birth and survival of Cronus's hunger to her marriage with Zeus and her persecution of his lovers, from her grand temples at Argos and Samos to her role as patron of Jason and the Argonauts, all reveal different facets of this complicated deity. She was neither entirely victim nor entirely villain, neither completely powerless nor absolutely in control. She operated within systems of power that both elevated and constrained her, using the tools available to pursue her goals and maintain her dignity. Hera's jealousy, while often the aspect of her mythology most remembered, was never simple or unmotivated. It sprang from genuine grievance, from Zeus's repeated betrayals of their marriage bond, from public humiliations that undermined her position and dignity. That she directed much of her anger at Zeus's lovers, rather than at Zeus himself, reveals the limitations of her power and the dangerous dynamics of divine marriage. She could not effectively punish the king of the gods, but she could assert herself against those she saw as trespassing on her domain. Yet Hera was more than her jealousy. She was a skilled political operator, capable of long-term planning and subtle manipulation, as shown in the story of Jason and her extended campaign against Peleus. She was a protector of those who honored her, as demonstrated by her support for Jason and her defense of her temples and sanctuaries. She was a symbol of female dignity and self-respect, refusing to be diminished even by her husband's behavior. The worship of Hera in ancient Greece reflected these multiple aspects of her character. Women prayed to her for help with marriage and childbirth, seeking her blessing for fertility and family harmony. Cities honored her as a patron deity, building magnificent temples and celebrating elaborate festivals. Athletes competed in games held in her honor. Oaths were sworn in her name. She was woven into the fabric of Greek religious and social life in countless ways. Her temples, built with such care and filled with precious offerings, demonstrated the reverence in which she was held. The Heraean at Olympia, older than the temple of Zeus, showed that Hera's worship predated and in some ways superseded even that of her husband. The massive structures at Samos and Argos rivaled any temples in the Greek world, proclaiming Hera's importance through their sheer scale and magnificence. The festivals celebrated in her honor, particularly the Heraea Games for young women, created spaces for female achievement and recognition in a society that offered women few such opportunities. These games honored Hera while also serving important social functions, helping young women transition toward marriage while celebrating their strength and abilities. As we have seen, Hera's influence extended far beyond ancient Greece. Through her Roman counterpart Juno, she shaped religious life throughout the Roman Empire. Her myths were preserved and passed down through millennia, influencing literature, art, and thought across Western civilization. Even today, when few people actively worship the Olympian gods, Hera remains a cultural reference point, a symbol whose meanings continue to resonate and evolve. The complexity of Hera's character reminds us that mythological figures are not simple symbols but multifaceted representations of human experiences and concerns. The ancient Greeks did not see Hera as simply good or simply bad. They recognized her as a powerful deity with her own motivations and limitations, her own virtues and flaws. She could be both protector and persecutor, both wise queen and jealous wife, both dignified goddess and suffering woman. This complexity makes Hera eternally relevant. Every age can find new meanings in her myths, new applications of her ancient stories to contemporary concerns. She speaks to questions about marriage and fidelity, about power and dignity, about how to maintain self-respect in difficult circumstances. She represents the challenges of being a woman in patriarchal systems, the complicated dynamics of marriage, the difficulty of wielding power effectively within constrained circumstances. For those who face betrayal in their own relationships, Hera's story offers a complicated model. She shows that pain and anger are legitimate responses to betrayal, that maintaining dignity and self-respect is important, that fighting back is sometimes necessary. But her story also raises questions about whether vengeance brings satisfaction, whether staying in a harmful relationship is truly strength, whether directing anger at the wrong targets serves any useful purpose. For those interested in ancient religion and mythology, Hera provides a window into how the Greeks understood marriage, family, and female power. Her worship reveals the concerns and priorities of ancient Greek women, the hopes they brought to her temples, the fears they asked her to allay. Her myths encoded lessons about proper behavior, warnings about the consequences of hubris, explanations for natural phenomena and historical events. For scholars of religion, gender, and power, Hera offers rich material for analysis. Her mythology can be examined through multiple lenses: psychoanalytic, feminist, structuralist, historical, anthropological. Each approach reveals different insights into this ancient goddess and the culture that created and worshipped her. As we conclude our exploration of Hera's mythic life, let us remember that she was, above all, the queen. She sat upon a throne beside Zeus on Olympus, crowned with a diadem, holding a scepter of authority, attended by peacocks whose tail feathers bore the 100 eyes of faithful Argus. She was powerful and dignified, commanding and majestic, a goddess who demanded and received respect from gods and mortals alike. The thunder may have belonged to Zeus, but the throne of Olympus was shared. The kingdom of the gods had a queen, and her name was Hera. Through all her contradictions and complexities, through all her power and limitations, through all her suffering and strength, she remained always and forever the Queen of Heaven, the protector of marriage, the goddess who watched over women, children, and families throughout the Greek world. Her temples may now lie in ruins, her festivals no longer celebrated, her priestesses long silent. But the stories remain, passed down through 3,000 years, still capable of moving us, challenging us, making us think about marriage and power, dignity and revenge, loyalty and betrayal. Hera endures in these stories, in these myths that continue to resonate because they speak to experiences and emotions that transcend any particular time or place. So as you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps spare a thought for Hera, the eternal queen. Think of her sitting on her throne, crowned and regal, looking out over the realm she shared in ruling. Think of the women who prayed to her across the centuries, seeking her blessing and protection. Think of the temples built in her honor, the sacrifices offered on her altars, the games run in her name. Remember that the old gods may no longer be worshipped, but they are not entirely forgotten. They live on in the stories we tell, in the patterns they represent, in the questions they raise about human nature and divine power. And with that thought, let yourself rest. May your dreams be peaceful, your sleep deep and restorative. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life and legends of Hera, Queen of Olympus. If you enjoyed this exploration of Greek mythology, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to Slumber Scrolls. We have many more stories to tell, many more journeys through history and legend to undertake together. Sleep well, and may you find the same strength and dignity in your own life that Hera embodied through all her trials and triumphs. Until next time.